Working the night shift as a cleaner in an office block was a lonely job, but it paid the bills. The routine was simple. I'd arrive at 10 p.m. and work until 2 a.m., cleaning and tidying up the building floor by floor. Most nights, it was just me and Eddie, the security guard. But one night, things took a chilling turn. I walked into the building, exchanged a nod with Eddie, and headed up to the 4th floor, where I usually started my cleaning. It was quiet, as always, the only sound being the faint hum of the office equipment in the rooms. I began my work, emptying trash cans and wiping down desks. As I moved down to the 3rd floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the usual sense of isolation, it was something more unsettling. I glanced back and saw a man in the distance, a stranger, following me down the hallway. My heart started to race as I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that it was just a late-night worker or a visitor who had lost their way. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling of unease. I didn't recognize the man, and he didn't look like an employee. I reached the end of the hallway and turned into a room, pretending to focus on my cleaning tasks while keeping an eye on the man's reflection in the window. He was getting closer, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Panic surged through me as I realized he was heading right for the room I was in. I wanted to call out for Eddie, but fear had paralyzed my voice. All I could do was watch as the man entered the room. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, and his eyes held an unsettling intensity. He didn't say a word, he just stared at me. Finally, I managed to stammer out, "Can I help you? Are you lost?" The man's lips curled into a chilling smile, and he replied in a low, gravelly voice, "Lost? No, I'm right where I need to be." My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone, my trembling fingers dialing Eddie's number. I knew I needed help, and I hoped he would pick up quickly. But there was no answer from the security guard. The stranger continued to approach me, his gaze never leaving mine. I backed away, my heart in my throat, and tried to make a break for the door. But before I could reach it, the man lunged at me, his hands outstretched. I screamed, my voice piercing the silence of the office block, and struggled to fend him off. We grappled in the dimly lit room, knocking over cleaning supplies and furniture in our frantic struggle. I could feel the man's strength, and it terrified me. Just when I thought I couldn't fight him off any longer, I heard the sound of footsteps running down the hallway. It was Eddie, the security guard, finally responding to my call for help. He burst into the room and, with a strength I hadn't expected, managed to restrain the intruder. The police arrived shortly after, and they arrested the man. Eddie later explained that he had been patrolling the upper floors and had heard my scream. If he hadn't arrived when he did, I shuddered to think what might have happened. The man was taken away by the police, but he never offered any explanation for his presence in the office block that night. I never found out who he was or what he had intended to do. It was a chilling encounter that left me scarred and terrified to work alone at night ever again. To this day, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if Eddie hadn't come to my rescue. Being a night terror had its moments, both heartwarming and challenging. I had cared for Sheila, a sweet elderly lady, for years. Her gentle demeanor had made it a pleasure to be there for her during the night hours when she needed assistance. But one night, everything changed. I received a call from the company that Sheila had taken a fall at home. They told me it was a slip and that she needed immediate attention. Worried, I rushed to her house, where I had spent countless nights before. I knew every corner, every creaky floorboard, and the comforting routine of caring for Sheila. As I entered her home, a wave of anxiety washed over me. The dimly lit hallway felt eerie, and the air seemed heavy with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I called out for Sheila, but there was no response. My heart raced as I followed the faint sound of a whimper into her bedroom. What I found there shattered the calm routine we had established over the years. Sheila lay on the floor, her frail body bruised and battered. It wasn't a simple slip. She had been attacked, her eyes filled with terror as she gazed up at me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I rushed to her side, cradling her head gently in my arms. I could barely comprehend the cruelty of the person who had done this to her. Sheila was a defenseless, kind woman who had never harmed a soul. I called the police and waited with Sheila, comforting her as best as I could. She was in shock, unable to speak coherently about what had happened. I knew I had to stay strong for her, to be her advocate in this horrifying situation. The police arrived, and they began their investigation, asking me questions about Sheila and anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. But the truth was, I couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She had no enemies, only friends and family who loved her dearly. As the hours passed, the feeling of unease in the house intensified. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched, that the attacker might still be nearby. The police assured me that they were doing everything they could to find the person responsible, but that did little to ease my fears. Days turned into weeks, and Sheila slowly began to recover from her physical injuries. But emotionally, she was a shadow of her former self. The trauma of the attack had left deep scars, and she became withdrawn, haunted by the memory of that horrifying night. The police investigation led to dead ends, and it seemed like the attacker had vanished without a trace. The uncertainty of not knowing who had hurt Sheila or why weighed heavily on me. I couldn't help but feel like I had failed to protect her. Despite the trauma, Sheila remained in her home, determined to regain her independence. I continued to care for her, but every night was filled with dread, wondering if the attacker would return. I installed security measures and kept a vigilant watch over her. Years passed, and Sheila eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep. I had stayed with her until the end, a loyal friend and caregiver. But the mystery of the attack remained unsolved. Working the night shift at the gas station had become a mundane routine for me. Most nights were quiet, with only a few trucks passing through. But one night, everything changed, and I found myself in a nightmare that I'll never forget. It was a chilly and moonless night when a beat-up old sedan pulled into the gas station. Two men stepped out, and something about their appearance immediately sent a shiver down my spine. They were unkempt, their clothes tattered and stained. Their eyes darted around nervously as they approached the counter. I forced a polite smile and greeted them as they entered. The taller of the two men, with greasy, disheveled hair, mumbled a response. The other, shorter one, remained silent, but his eyes were fixated on me with an intensity that made me uneasy. They both seemed on edge, and I couldn't help but feel that something was off about the situation. My instinct screamed at me to be cautious, but I continued to serve them, trying to keep my composure. As the taller man paid for his gas, I noticed a glint of something metallic hidden beneath his jacket. It looked like the handle of a knife, and my heart skipped a beat. Panic surged through me as I realized that I might be in danger. I watched them closely as they moved to the side, seemingly engrossed in hushed conversation. Their eyes never left me, and the feeling of being scrutinized intensified. I considered calling the police, but I had no concrete reason to do so yet. The minutes dragged on, and the tension in the air became unbearable. The two men were clearly not in a hurry, and the longer they lingered, the more my anxiety grew. I knew I needed to find a way to get them to leave without provoking them. I began to feign a headache, rubbing my temples and sighing loudly. I hoped they would take the hint and finish up their business. But instead, they started whispering to each other again, their voices growing increasingly agitated. Finally, the taller man turned to me, his eyes filled with an unsettling mix of anger and desperation. He said something about needing directions and getting lost in the area. It was a flimsy excuse, and I could tell he was trying to keep me engaged in conversation. I stammered out some vague directions, urging them to leave. But they didn't move. Instead, the shorter man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. I could see the glimmer of suspicion in his gaze, and I knew I had to tread carefully. Just as the situation seemed on the verge of escalating, the sound of a car engine approaching the gas station filled the air. Headlights flooded the parking lot, revealing another customer pulling in to refuel. The two men exchanged a panicked glance and abruptly left, their car tires screeching as they sped away. Relief washed over me as I watched them go, but my heart still raced with fear. I immediately called the police and reported the strange encounter, providing them with a description of the men and their vehicle. The police arrived soon after and took my statement. They assured me that they would investigate the incident and patrol the area more frequently. But despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that those two men had brought something sinister with them that night. For weeks, I was haunted by the encounter, constantly looking over my shoulder and fearing the return of the strange men. I never found out who they were or what they had wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: that night had forever changed the way I viewed the night shift at the gas station. The mundane had turned into a nightmare, and the memory of those two men would stay with me. Driving the night bus had its quirks, but I had grown used to the solitude and the occasional odd passenger. It was approaching midnight, and I was on one of the final stretches of my usual late-night route, with only 6 more stops to go. The bus was empty, and the hum of the engine was the only sound that broke the silence. As I approached a dimly lit, isolated bus stop, I noticed 3 figures huddled on the bench. It was unusual to see anyone waiting at this hour, but I pulled over, thinking they were just late-night travelers trying to get home. I opened the doors, and the 3 men, all dressed in ragged clothes, stepped onto the bus. There was something unsettling about their appearance, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. They seemed disheveled, with wild, darting eyes that made me uneasy. Without a word, they made their way to the back of the bus, sitting in the last row. I kept my eye on them through the rearview mirror as I continued on the route. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted, and a sense of foreboding hung in the air. I tried to push aside my unease, chalking it up to late-night fatigue, but something about those 3 men gnawed at me. They whispered among themselves, and I couldn't make out their words, but their hushed tones sent shivers down my spine. As I pulled up to the next stop, a feeling of dread washed over me. I had a gut instinct that something was very wrong. I watched in the rearview mirror as one of the men got up from his seat and moved toward the front of the bus. He approached the fare box and stood there, not saying a word. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. The other 2 men remained in their seats, their eyes locked onto me with an unsettling intensity. I cleared my throat and asked, "Where are you headed?" The man at the fare box didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light of the bus. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. These men weren't passengers, they had other intentions. I knew I had to act fast. Without hesitation, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and lurched the bus forward, sending the man stumbling backward. His 2 companions shouted in anger as the bus roared to life, but I didn't stop. The road ahead stretched out in darkness, and I sped toward the next stop, praying that someone would be waiting there. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel as I tried to maintain control of the bus. As I pulled up to the next stop, I saw a lone figure waiting. I slammed on the brakes, and the bus screeched to a halt. Without waiting for the doors to fully open, I shouted, "Get on! Quick!" The passenger, a young woman, looked bewildered but didn't hesitate. She jumped onto the bus just as the 3 men from the back lunged forward, their faces contorted with rage. I slammed the doors shut, leaving the men outside, shouting and pounding on the bus. The woman and I locked eyes, both of us terrified by what had just transpired. I drove her to the next stop, where she could safely exit, and then continued on my route. My heart was still pounding, and the memory of those 3 men would haunt me for the rest of my days. I reported the incident to the authorities, but the men were never found. The police told me that they had likely been planning something sinister, and I had narrowly escaped a chilling encounter that could have ended in tragedy. From that night on, I drove the night bus with a constant sense of unease, always watching the rearview mirror, afraid that those 3 men might return. Working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store had its share of odd encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened one fateful night around 1 a.m. The store was dimly lit, with only a few customers passing through. The quiet hum of the refrigerators filled the air as I idly scanned the aisles for any misplaced items. That's when I saw him, a tall man in his late 40s, wearing a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved through the store slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. There was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As he browsed the shelves, I kept a watchful eye on him from behind the counter. He would pick up items, inspect them, and then put them back in a meticulous and deliberate manner. It was as if he were searching for something, but he didn't seem to be interested in actually buying anything. The minutes ticked by, and the tension in the store grew. I felt a growing sense of unease as the man continued to roam the aisles, occasionally glancing in my direction. His eyes, obscured by the shadow of his hat, seemed to bore into me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to shake off my unease, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just an eccentric customer with peculiar shopping habits. But then he did something that sent a chill coursing through my veins. The man suddenly stopped in front of one of the store's security cameras, the one that provided a clear view of the counter where I was stationed. He reached up and, with deliberate slowness, adjusted the angle of the camera, tilting it away from me. My heart raced as I watched him tamper with the surveillance equipment. It was a blatant and sinister act, and there was no mistaking his intent. Panic welled up inside me, and I knew I needed to act fast. I picked up the phone and pretended to make a call to the police, hoping that the man would catch on and leave. But he didn't budge. Instead, he continued to stare at me with those unnerving eyes, a malevolent grin tugging at the corners of his lips. My hands were trembling as I hung up the phone. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I reached for the store's panic button, hidden discreetly beneath the counter, and pressed it without hesitation. An alarm blared throughout the store, echoing off the walls. The man's grin faltered for a moment as the shrill sound pierced the air, but he didn't make a move to leave. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted menacingly in the dim light. It was a knife. Fear coursed through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. I was trapped behind the counter, defenseless, and the man with the knife was slowly making his way toward me. His footsteps were measured and deliberate, each one bringing him closer to where I stood. I knew I had to act fast, so I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy flashlight, and held it tightly in my trembling hands. The man was only a few feet away now, his eyes locked onto mine with a chilling determination. In that moment, I did something I never thought I was capable of. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I swung the flashlight with all my might, aiming for the man's head. The impact sent him staggering backward, and the knife clattered to the floor. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted to the exit and burst out of the store, gasping for breath. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air as the police arrived, responding to the panic button alarm. They apprehended the man, who was now bleeding from a gash on his forehead. As they led him away in handcuffs, I watched with a mix of relief and disbelief. I had survived a chilling encounter that had felt like a nightmare come to life. The man's intentions were unclear, but his actions had left an indelible mark on me, a haunting reminder that danger could lurk in the most ordinary of places, even a 24-hour convenience store in the dead of night. This happened to me a couple of years back now. See, being a flight attendant on the red-eye flights was part of my routine, and I thought I had seen it all. But one night, as we cruised at 30,000 feet, a passenger's request would plunge me into a nightmarish encounter I would never forget. The cabin was dimly lit, and most passengers were asleep or trying to get some rest. My rounds had become routine, checking on passengers, serving drinks, and making sure everyone was comfortable. As I moved down the aisle, I noticed a man in his late 30s, his face etched with anxiety. He was fidgeting nervously, his hands trembling as he clutched his armrest. I approached him with a friendly smile, trying to ease his discomfort. "Is there anything I can help you with, sir?" He glanced around as if to ensure no one was listening, then leaned in closer and whispered, "I need to tell you something terrible." My heart raced as I tried to comprehend the gravity of his words. He looked desperate, his eyes darting around nervously. I urged him to continue, wondering what could be so horrifying that he felt compelled to share it with a stranger on a plane. With a quivering voice, he began to recount a story that would send shivers down my spine. He explained that before boarding our flight, he had committed an unthinkable act. He had butchered a family in their own home. My stomach churned as he described the gruesome details of his actions. He had entered their house, unaware of who they were, and carried out a merciless massacre. The brutality of his words left me in shock. Tears welled up in his eyes as he confessed the horrific crime. He explained that he couldn't bear the weight of his guilt any longer and felt compelled to reveal his dark secret to someone. He had chosen me, a stranger on a plane, as the recipient of his confession. The realization of what I had just heard hit me like a tidal wave. I was trapped in an airplane with a man who had committed unspeakable atrocities, and there was nowhere to run. Fear gripped me, and I struggled to maintain my composure. I knew I had to act carefully. My first instinct was to inform the authorities, but I had to consider the safety of the passengers and crew on board. I couldn't risk causing a panic mid-flight. I tried to engage the man in conversation, hoping to keep him occupied while I devised a plan to alert the authorities discreetly. He continued to recount the gruesome details of the murder, his voice filled with anguish. As I listened, I realized that the man's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. He seemed tormented by his actions, haunted by the faces of the family he had slaughtered. I took a deep breath and decided to approach the captain with my concerns. I discreetly relayed the man's confession and urged the captain to contact the authorities on the ground. The captain's expression mirrored my own shock and disbelief. With the plane still in flight, we had to proceed cautiously. The authorities were alerted, and they assured us that they would be waiting to apprehend the man upon our arrival. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that help was on the way. The flight continued, but the atmosphere on board was tense. Passengers had picked up on the unease, and whispers of concern spread throughout the cabin. I did my best to reassure them that the situation was under control, even though my own anxiety was reaching its peak. Finally, as we touched down at our destination, the man was met by airport security. He was escorted off the plane in handcuffs, his face contorted with a mix of regret and despair. As I disembarked, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I had survived a chilling encounter with a man who had committed an unthinkable crime. I used to work the night shift at a call center that dealt with customers seeking assistance with their telecommunications products. Most nights were mundane, with routine calls about billing issues, technical glitches, and the occasional irate customer. But one fateful night, I received a call that would shatter the monotony and haunt me forever. The clock had just struck midnight, and I was settling into my dimly lit cubicle, surrounded by the hum of computers and the occasional ring of incoming calls. I slipped on my headset, preparing for another long night of customer service. As I answered the next call, I greeted the customer with the usual script. But there was something off about this caller's voice, a sinister undertone that sent a chill down my spine. The caller identified themselves as Mr. Johnson and claimed to be experiencing issues with their home phone line. As I began to troubleshoot, Mr. Johnson's tone grew increasingly disturbing. He started sharing unsettling stories about his neighbors, the Andersons, who lived just a few houses down from him. With each word, Mr. Johnson's voice oozed malice. He described in gruesome detail how he had been tormenting the Andersons for weeks. He spoke of late-night break-ins, strange occurrences around their home, and a series of anonymous threats. I was stunned, unable to comprehend the darkness unfolding on the other end of the line. Mr. Johnson's words painted a horrifying picture of psychological torture and physical harm inflicted on an unsuspecting family. My training hadn't prepared me for this. I tried to keep Mr. Johnson talking, desperately hoping to gather enough information to help the authorities intervene. He continued his macabre confession, revealing the depths of his obsession with the Andersons. As he spoke, I discreetly signaled my supervisor to listen in on the call and informed them of the disturbing nature of the conversation. My supervisor contacted the authorities while I kept Mr. Johnson engaged. The minutes dragged on like hours as I listened to Mr. Johnson's twisted tales of terror. He seemed to revel in the fear he had instilled in his neighbors, sharing grisly anecdotes of his actions in chilling detail. Finally, I heard the sirens approaching in the background, a glimmer of hope that the nightmare might come to an end. I continued to talk to Mr. Johnson, trying to keep him on the line until the police arrived. When the officers finally arrived at Mr. Johnson's residence, they apprehended him, ending his reign of terror over the Andersons. I felt a mix of relief and horror as the call came to an end. The next morning, news of Mr. Johnson's arrest and the horrifying ordeal he had inflicted on his neighbors spread like wildfire. The Andersons had endured unimaginable suffering, and the entire community was left shaken. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The call center, once a place of routine and monotony, had become the backdrop for a real-life horror story. I couldn't help but wonder how many other sinister secrets lurked behind the seemingly ordinary calls that came through our lines. The encounter with Mr. Johnson haunted me long after that night, a grim reminder of the darkness that could lurk within the human soul. It was a chilling experience that I would never forget, a nightmarish journey into the depths of a disturbed mind. I used to work as a security guard on the night shift at a sprawling warehouse complex. My job was pretty routine: monitor the security cameras, patrol the premises, and ensure that everything was in order. Most nights were quiet, with nothing more exciting than a few stray cats setting off the motion sensors. But one night, everything changed. It was around 3 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something odd on one of the security cameras. There was a figure, hunched over, moving cautiously near the perimeter fence. My heart quickened as I realized that it was an intruder. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, called for backup, and headed in the direction of the intruder. The warehouse complex was enormous, with rows upon rows of storage units and dimly lit corridors. The only sounds were the hum of machinery and the occasional rustling of the wind. As I approached the area where I had seen the intruder, a sense of unease washed over me. It was too quiet, too still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I rounded a corner and came face to face with the intruder. He was a tall man, wearing dark clothing and a mask that concealed most of his face. In his hand, he held a crowbar, a menacing tool that sent a shiver down my spine. We locked eyes for a split second, and in that moment, I could see the malice in his gaze. Without hesitation, the intruder lunged at me with the crowbar raised high. I barely had time to react, and I instinctively raised my arms to shield myself from the impending blow. The impact was excruciating, and I felt the searing pain shoot through my arms. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling to the ground and casting eerie shadows on the walls. The intruder wasted no time and came at me again, his eyes filled with madness. I knew I had to fight back to protect myself and the warehouse. With all the strength I could muster, I swung my radio at the intruder, making contact with his shoulder. He grunted in pain, momentarily stunned. It was my chance to escape, to call for help, but my injuries made it difficult to move quickly. I staggered down the nearest corridor, my vision blurred from the pain. I could hear the intruder pursuing me, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Panic gripped me as I fumbled to radio for backup, desperately trying to relay my location and the threat I was facing. As I rounded another corner, I spotted a maintenance room with a heavy metal door. I limped inside, my heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. The intruder banged on the door, his violent threats and obscenities echoing in the confined space. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever, and my injuries were getting worse by the second. I could feel blood seeping from my arms, my vision fading in and out. My radio crackled to life as backup arrived, their voices a lifeline in the midst of this nightmare. The intruder continued to pound on the door, but the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. The police had arrived, and I could hear them shouting at the intruder to surrender. The standoff continued for agonizing minutes until the sound of handcuffs clicking into place signaled the intruder's arrest. I was rushed to the hospital, where my injuries were treated. It turned out that my quick thinking and the arrival of backup had saved my life that night. The intruder, a man with a long history of criminal activity, was apprehended and taken into custody. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the terror of that night. The encounter had left me physically and emotionally scarred, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. The warehouse had lost its sense of security, and every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat. I eventually left my job as a security guard, unable to overcome the trauma of that chilling encounter. So, my name's Barry, and many years back I was a night baker at a small, family-owned bakery on the outskirts of town. The night shift was quiet, and I enjoyed the solitude and the comforting scent of freshly baked bread that filled the air. But one night, as I was going about my usual routine, something happened that would forever haunt my nightmares. It was well past midnight, and I was alone in the bakery, my only companions the ovens and the dough I was kneading. The soft hum of the industrial-sized mixers was the only sound in the room, and I was lost in my own world of flour and yeast. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible creaking sound. I froze, the dough in my hands forgotten. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It couldn't be the ovens, they had been turned off for the night. Then, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak, like the sound of an old wooden floorboard being stepped on. Panic gripped me as I realized that someone was inside the bakery with me. My first thought was that it must be a coworker playing a prank, but the dread in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I grabbed a rolling pin, my only makeshift weapon, and slowly made my way toward the source of the noise. The bakery was dimly lit, with shadows dancing on the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the storage room, where the creaking sound seemed to originate. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of darkness beyond it. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open, and what I saw next froze my blood. A man stood there, shrouded in darkness, his features obscured by a hood and a mask. His eyes, though, burned with an unsettling intensity. In his hand, he held a knife, a large, gleaming blade that glinted in the faint light. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other, the rolling pin in my hands feeling utterly inadequate. I had no idea who this intruder was or what he wanted, but it was clear that I was in mortal danger. Without warning, the intruder lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. Instinct kicked in, and I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly blade. My rolling pin swung down in a desperate counterattack, striking the intruder's arm. He let out a pained cry, and the knife clattered to the ground. It was my chance to escape, and I didn't waste a second. I bolted from the storage room, my heart racing as I ran through the bakery, not daring to look back. As I burst out of the bakery's back door, I could hear the intruder's enraged shouts behind me. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, not stopping until I reached the safety of a nearby gas station, where I called the police. The authorities arrived quickly and searched the bakery, but the intruder was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, and it seemed as though he had vanished into thin air. I gave them a description of the man, but I had never seen him before in my life. In the days that followed, the police launched an investigation, but the intruder remained elusive. I couldn't return to work at the bakery. The trauma of that night was too much to bear. I constantly wondered who the man was and why he had targeted me. It's been years since that terrifying encounter, but the memory still haunts me. I've moved to a new town and found a different line of work, but the fear and paranoia have never truly left me. That night, in the heart of a bakery, I fought for my life. I used to work the night shift at a local diner in a quiet neighborhood. The diner was a cozy place, frequented by regulars who came for late-night coffee and comfort food. My shift typically ended at 1 a.m., and I enjoyed the peacefulness of the night as I walked home. But one night, that peacefulness would shatter into a nightmare I could never forget. As I stepped out of the diner's back entrance, I noticed the street was unusually empty. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by an eerie stillness. I tightened my grip on my bag and quickened my pace, eager to get home. Just a few steps from the diner, I sensed movement behind me. Two shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by the dim streetlights. Panic surged through me as I realized I was now alone, and these men were approaching me with purpose. Without thinking, I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear their heavy footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. Fear propelled me forward, and I sprinted down the dimly lit streets, desperate to escape my pursuers. The men's voices rang out, taunting me with menacing threats. I could feel their presence closing in, and it was clear they were not going to give up easily. My mind raced, trying to figure out where to go for safety. My apartment was still a few blocks away, and the thought of leading these strangers to my door was unthinkable. I veered off the main road, hoping to lose them in the maze of residential streets. My breath came in ragged gasps as I darted through alleyways and across darkened parks. I could hear the men behind me, their footsteps relentless. My phone was in my pocket, but I dared not call the police just yet. I needed a plan, an escape route. I spotted a convenience store up ahead, its bright fluorescent lights a beacon of hope. As I burst through the doors, I shouted to the clerk for help, desperately explaining the situation. The kind clerk immediately called the police while guiding me into a back room. I crouched there, trembling and terrified, as the minutes crawled by. The police arrived swiftly, and I listened anxiously to their conversation with the clerk through the thin walls. They arrested the two men, who had a history of violent offenses. My heart was still pounding as I gave my statement to the police, recounting the terrifying chase through the deserted streets. The officers assured me that I had done the right thing, and they were relieved to have caught the men before they could harm me. They offered to escort me home, and I accepted their protection, grateful for their presence. That night forever changed me. I was a night concierge at a high-end apartment building in the heart of the city. My job was straightforward: keep an eye on the front desk, handle the occasional resident request, and ensure the building was secure. Most nights, the job was uneventful, and I enjoyed the solitude. One frigid winter night, the building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak and rustle seem magnified. It was close to midnight, and I was scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a soft but distinct tapping on the glass door leading to the lobby. I glanced up, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing outside in the darkness. The stranger was bundled up in a heavy coat, their face obscured by a scarf and a beanie pulled low over their eyes. My first thought was that it was a resident who had locked themselves out, and I got up to let them in. But as I approached the door, unease settled in. The person didn't move, and their stance seemed unnatural, as if they were frozen in place. I pressed the intercom button and asked if they needed assistance. No response. I repeated my question, but the stranger just continued to stand there, tapping their gloved fingers rhythmically against the glass. The sound of the tapping grew louder, more insistent, and it sent shivers down my spine. I decided to call the police, explaining the situation and the odd behavior of the person outside. The dispatcher assured me they would send a patrol car, and I felt a sense of relief. As I hung up the phone, I returned my gaze to the figure outside. That's when I noticed something chilling. Their eyes were fixed on me, not the door. It was as if they were studying me, and a feeling of dread washed over me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. The tapping continued, each tap more deliberate than the last. I contemplated locking myself in the security office, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. When the police finally arrived, they approached the stranger cautiously. I watched from the safety of the lobby as they tried to engage in conversation, but the person remained silent, their eyes never leaving me. With a sudden, jerky movement, the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The police searched the area, but found no trace of them. I was left with a profound sense of unease, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain the stranger's bizarre behavior, and it haunted my thoughts long after the incident. In the following weeks, I became hypervigilant during my night shifts, constantly checking security cameras and double-checking the locks. I never saw the mysterious person again, but the memory of that chilling encounter continued to torment me. To this day, I can't help but wonder what their intentions were, and why they had singled me out that night. It's a nightmare I can't forget. Working was always a drag at the old hotel that had seen better days. The pay was meager, but it was a job, and I'd seen my fair share of eccentric guests. One particular night, however, stands out as the most chilling encounter I've ever had. It was 2:13 a.m., and I was on the night shift. The lobby was empty, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the antique chandelier overhead and the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock against the wall. I was flipping through a magazine to pass the time when the phone at the front desk rang, jolting me from my reverie. I answered it, and a guest from the third floor spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. They explained that there was a problem with their room's heating, and they were feeling uncomfortably cold. Politely, I assured them I would be right up with a space heater. As I climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The corridor was dimly lit, and the old wallpaper seemed to peel ominously. I reached the guest's room, room 313, and knocked gently. The door creaked open slowly, and I was met with a frigid blast of air. The guest was seated in a chair by the window, their back turned toward me. I announced myself and entered cautiously, asking whether they would like the space heater. There was a pause, and then a soft, eerie whisper from the guest, "Behind you." I turned around to find them standing inches from my face, their eyes wide and unblinking, filled with an unnatural intensity. The space heater dropped from my hand, and my heart raced as I stumbled backward. In a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the abyss, the guest said, "You don't belong here." "None of you do." I was paralyzed with fear as they continued, speaking in disjointed sentences about secrets hidden within the hotel's walls, about forgotten guests, and about the hotel's dark history. They spoke of things that should never have been known, and my mind struggled to comprehend their cryptic words. Suddenly, they reached out and grabbed my arm with a strength that defied their frail appearance. Their grip was like a vice, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my arm. With a final, chilling warning, they hissed, "Leave this place before it devours you too." With great effort, I wrenched free from their grasp and fled the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended the stairs and reached the safety of the lobby. I called the police immediately, explaining the disturbing encounter. When the police arrived, they found the guest in room 313 had disappeared, leaving the window wide open despite the freezing temperatures outside. There was no trace of them, and the room was empty, as if they had never been there. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that chilling encounter. The hotel's dark history and the cryptic warnings of the guest haunted my dreams. I quit my job soon after, unable to bear the weight of the unexplainable terror that had invaded my life. To this day, I avoid passing by that old hotel, and I can't help but wonder about the secrets that lie hidden within its walls and the enigmatic guest who left me with a nightmare I will never forget. I've been a taxi driver for years, and I've always loved my job, especially the night shifts. There's a certain tranquility to the city at night, the empty streets, and the occasional lone passenger looking for a ride home. It's a job that lets me be my own boss, and I've had my fair share of interesting passengers. But one night, I picked up a customer who would make me question everything. It was around 2 a.m., and I was cruising through the quiet streets, scanning for potential fares. The radio played softly in the background as I waited for the dispatch to come through with a call. That's when I got it, a request from a customer named Mr. Smith, asking for a pickup in a dimly lit alleyway. I pulled into the alley and found a man standing there, his face partially obscured by the shadows cast by the flickering streetlight. He climbed into the back seat without saying a word, and I noticed he was wearing a long, dark overcoat that seemed out of place for the mild weather. I greeted him with a friendly, "Good evening, sir. Where can I take you tonight?" He didn't respond immediately, and the silence grew uncomfortably long. I stole a glance at him through the rearview mirror, and that's when I noticed something odd: his eyes. They were cold, lifeless, devoid of any emotion, like staring into the abyss. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Take me to 34 Maple Street." I started the meter and pulled away from the curb, making my way through the quiet streets toward Maple Street. The passenger remained silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. As we approached Maple Street, I couldn't help but notice that it was a dead end, a dimly lit cul-de-sac surrounded by overgrown trees. I glanced at the passenger again, now feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. "We're here," I said, pulling over to the curb. The man didn't move. He continued to stare straight ahead, his expression unchanging. I cleared my throat, growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Sir, we've arrived at Maple Street. Do you need any assistance?" That's when he turned his head slowly to look at me, and his eyes locked onto mine in the rearview mirror. "You can't imagine the things I've seen," he said in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call the police if needed. But before I could do anything, the passenger reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. He handed it to me, and as I looked at it, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, sitting behind the wheel of my taxi, taken from behind. The photograph was recent, and I realized it had been taken while I was waiting for a fare. Panic set in as I realized that this man had been watching me, stalking me. "You shouldn't have taken this job," he said, his voice taking on an eerie calmness. Fear coursed through me, and I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape. But before I could open the door, the passenger lunged at me, his hands wrapping around my throat. I gasped for air, my vision growing dim as he squeezed the life out of me. In a desperate struggle, I managed to free one hand and jabbed my fingers into his eyes. He howled in pain, releasing his grip on my throat. I kicked open the door and stumbled out of the taxi, gasping for breath as I collapsed onto the pavement. The passenger emerged from the taxi, his face contorted with rage, but I managed to crawl away and scream for help. Residents of a nearby house heard my cries and rushed to my aid, scaring the assailant away. The police arrived shortly after and launched a search for the man, but he vanished into the night, leaving me shaken and traumatized. The photograph he had shown me served as a grim reminder that there are dark forces lurking in the shadows, and that some passengers can turn a routine job into a nightmare beyond imagination. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting, and that my life would never be the same again. I've been a road sweeper for as long as I can remember, and I've grown used to the solitude of the night shift. It's a lonely job, driving up and down the empty streets, cleaning away the debris of the day. But one night, as I made my rounds, I had an encounter that would haunt me forever. It was a particularly cold night, and a thick fog had settled over the city. I could barely see a few feet in front of me as I maneuvered the sweeper down the deserted streets. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the swish of the brushes against the asphalt. As I turned onto a dimly lit side street, I noticed a figure up ahead, standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, thinking it was a pedestrian who had ventured out too late. But as I got closer, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The figure was dressed in tattered clothes, their back turned to me. They appeared to be hunched over, as if in pain. I honked the horn, hoping to get their attention and urge them to move out of the way, but they didn't react. I parked the sweeper a safe distance away and stepped out, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out to the person, asking if they needed help, but there was no response. The fog seemed to swallow my words, and the silence was suffocating. As I approached the figure, dread gnawed at me. Something about this situation felt deeply unsettling. I could now see their disheveled hair and torn clothing more clearly. They seemed to be muttering to themselves, their voice a low, incomprehensible murmur. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice quivering. Suddenly, the figure turned to face me, and I recoiled in horror. Their face was contorted into a grotesque mask of pain and anguish, and their eyes were vacant, devoid of any humanity. It was as if they were trapped in some nightmarish trance. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and fumbled for my phone to call the police. But as I glanced back at the figure, I realized they were moving toward me, their shuffling footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Panic surged through me, and I jumped into the sweeper, slamming the door shut. I locked it and revved the engine, desperately trying to back away from the approaching figure. But to my horror, they continued to advance, their movements erratic and disjointed. I finally managed to maneuver the sweeper onto the road and sped away, leaving the nightmare figure behind. As I looked back in my rearview mirror, I saw them standing there, still and lifeless, in the middle of the fog-shrouded street. I reported the encounter to the police, but they could find no trace of the mysterious figure when they arrived at the scene. I couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by the memory of that night and the chilling encounter with a person who seemed to be trapped in a world of torment. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there are things lurking in the shadows, things that defy explanation and understanding. And every time I'm on the night shift, I can't help but glance nervously into the darkness, wondering if I'll ever encounter something as nightmarish as that fog-shrouded figure again. I used to work the night shift as a pharmacy technician, and I can tell you that it's usually a quiet and uneventful job. Most nights, I'd fill prescriptions, restock shelves, and maybe help a few customers who couldn't sleep and decided to pick up their medication in the middle of the night. But one night, something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. It was a rainy and cold night, and I had just finished refilling the pill dispensers when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be a doctor calling in a prescription or a nurse with a question about a medication. But the voice on the other end was neither of those. "Hello," the voice said, and it sounded shaky and anxious. "I need your help. Please, you have to listen." I asked what was wrong, and the person on the line began to explain that they were in excruciating pain. They described their symptoms in detail, and it was clear that they were in distress. They begged me for advice on what to take or do to alleviate the pain. I explained that I couldn't diagnose over the phone and that they should consider calling 911 or visiting the nearest emergency room. But they refused, saying they couldn't leave their house, which was miles away from the hospital. As the conversation continued, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The person's descriptions of their pain were becoming more and more extreme, and their voice seemed to change, becoming almost inhuman. It was as if they were trying to mimic human suffering, but failing miserably. I glanced at the clock and realized it was close to 3 a.m. I was alone in the pharmacy, and the feeling of isolation added to my discomfort. I tried to stay calm and professional, but the person on the other end of the line was relentless, insisting that I help them. They started to make strange, disjointed statements. They claimed that they knew where I lived, that they were watching me, and that they could see me right at that moment. Panic surged through me, and I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. I tried to shake off the unsettling call, convincing myself that it was just a prank or a disturbed individual seeking attention. But as I turned to go back to my work, I froze in my tracks. A chill ran down my spine as I saw a figure standing outside the pharmacy window. It was dark outside, but the figure was illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. They were wearing tattered clothes, and their face was obscured by a hood. My mind raced as I realized that this person matched the description the caller had given earlier. I fumbled to call the police, all the while keeping an eye on the figure outside. But as I looked away for just a moment to dial 911, they disappeared into the night. The police arrived soon after, but there was no sign of the mysterious figure. They took a report and assured me that they would patrol the area. I went home that morning shaken and unable to shake the feeling of being watched. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but wonder if the unsettling call and the appearance of the hooded figure were connected. I tried to put it behind me and continue with my job, but the fear lingered. I never received another call from that person, and I never saw the hooded figure again. But the memory of that night and the chilling encounter still haunts me. I'll never know who they were or what their intentions were, but I can't help but feel that I narrowly escaped something truly terrifying that night. I used to work the night shift at a small, unassuming office building. It was a job that paid the bills, but it was far from exciting. Most nights were routine, with little more than the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady drone of the photocopier to keep me company. But one night, everything changed, and I found myself in the midst of a chilling encounter that would haunt me forever. It was around 2 a.m., and I was hunched over my desk, trying to stay awake. My eyelids felt heavy, and I longed for the first rays of dawn to signal the end of my shift. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the hallway just outside my office. I strained my ears to listen, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time more distinct. It was a voice, low and raspy, muttering words I couldn't quite make out. My heart began to race as I realized that I was now alone in the building. My first instinct was to call security, but the phone on my desk was dead. Panic set in as I contemplated my options. I could stay in my office and hope that whoever was out there would go away, or I could venture into the hallway and confront the intruder. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept toward the door and cautiously peered out into the dimly lit corridor. My office was at the end of a long hallway, and the source of the whisper seemed to be coming from further down. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. As I moved closer, the words being whispered became clearer. It was a disjointed, eerie monologue, filled with strange references and unsettling threats. I couldn't make sense of it, but the tone of the voice sent shivers down my spine. It was a voice filled with malevolence and intent. I knew I had to do something, so I mustered all my courage and began to walk cautiously down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more the words began to form a coherent sentence, and I realized with horror that they were directed at me. The voice was saying things that no one should have known, details about my life, my family, and my deepest fears. It was as though the intruder had access to my most private thoughts and memories. I felt exposed and vulnerable, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I reached the source of the voice, a janitor's closet, and slowly pushed the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. There, huddled in the corner, was a disheveled figure, their eyes wild with madness. It was a coworker, someone I had known for years, but they were no longer the person I remembered. They continued to mutter their eerie monologue, their gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to talk to them, to understand what had driven them to this point, but their words grew more nonsensical and menacing. I backed away from the closet, my mind racing. I knew I had to get out of there, but the building was a labyrinth of darkened hallways and locked doors. I couldn't risk running into anyone else who had been affected by whatever had possessed my coworker. I made my way back to my office and locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for my phone and called the police, explaining the bizarre and terrifying situation I had found myself in. They assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay put. As I waited in my darkened office, I could hear the footsteps of the police officers approaching. When they finally arrived, they took my coworker into custody, and I watched as they were led away, still muttering their unsettling monologue. I was left to pick up the pieces of that night, trying to make sense of what had happened. My coworker was never the same after that, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly malevolent had taken hold of him. I quit my job shortly afterward, unable to shake the trauma of that chilling encounter. To this day, I don't know what caused my coworker to descend into madness, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some encounters are better left in the darkness of the past. Delivering dairy products to homes and businesses in the quiet suburban neighborhood where I grew up. It was a peaceful job, and I enjoyed the solitude of the early morning hours when most of the world was still asleep. But one fateful morning, as the clock struck just past 4 a.m., I stumbled upon an encounter that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was a typical morning, or so I thought. The streets were shrouded in darkness, and the only sounds were the soft hum of my delivery truck and the occasional chirping of crickets. I had a routine route, and I knew it like the back of my hand. Everything seemed ordinary until I reached the Sullivan's house. As I approached their driveway, I noticed something strange. The door that I knew should have been securely shut was ajar. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I parked my truck and approached the house with caution, The soft glow of a porch light cast eerie shadows on the front steps, and I could hear faint, muffled noises coming from inside. It was as if there were whispers in the darkness, voices I couldn't quite make out. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I crept closer to the open door, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden porch. The voices grew louder, and I could now distinguish the frantic, hushed tones of a man and a woman. Fear gnawed at my insides as I considered the possibility of an intruder or a domestic dispute. Summoning all my courage, I peered through the narrow opening of the door, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. The Sullivans, a seemingly ordinary couple who had been part of my route for years, were standing in the dimly lit living room. But they were now alone. A tall figure loomed over them, shrouded in darkness. The intruder's face was obscured, but I could see the glint of a knife in their hand, its blade catching the faint light. The man and woman were pleading for their lives, their voices trembling with terror. I knew I had to act, to call for help, to do something. But fear rooted me to the spot, rendering me helpless as I watched the horrifying scene unfold before my eyes. The intruder raised a knife, and I knew I couldn't bear to witness what would come next. Just as the blade descended, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, and the world seemed to slow down. It was the Sullivans' young daughter, who I hadn't noticed until that moment. Her scream jolted me into action, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The dispatcher answered, and I frantically whispered the details of the nightmare I was witnessing. She assured me that help was on the way, and I hung up, praying that it would arrive in time. In the minutes that felt like an eternity, I watched as the intruder turned toward the young girl, their knife still gleaming ominously. But before they could take another step, the blaring sirens of approaching police cars shattered the silence. The intruder fled into the darkness, leaving the Sullivans and their daughter shaken but alive. The police arrived just in time to give chase, but the assailant managed to escape. The Sullivans were grateful for my call, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a helpless witness to their terror. The events of that night left me traumatized, unable to continue my work as a milkman. I often wonder what drove someone to commit such a horrifying act, but I'll never know. All I can do is carry the burden of what I witnessed and hope that the Sullivans can find some semblance of peace in the aftermath of that chilling encounter. I used to work the night shift as a PAT tester, which meant my job was to ensure that electrical equipment in offices and factories was safe to use. It was a quiet gig, and I usually enjoyed the solitude of the late night hours when most people were tucked away in their beds. But one particular night would forever haunt my memories. I had just started my shift, making my way through a dimly lit office building filled with rows of desks and dormant computers. The only source of light was the faint glow of the exit signs, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cubicles. My job was mundane, checking cables, sockets, and appliances, one by one. As I made my rounds through the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a subtle unease, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I dismissed it as paranoia at first, but that unease only grew as the night wore on. Around 2 a.m., I entered a secluded corner of the building, where the office space transitioned into a storage area filled with cardboard boxes and old furniture. It was here that I saw him, a man, hunched over in the shadows, his silhouette barely discernible. Startled, I asked if he worked there, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at me with eyes that seemed devoid of any humanity. A chill ran down my spine as I continued to test the electrical equipment, desperately trying to ignore the unsettling presence in the room. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I carried on with my work. The man didn't move, but his unbroken gaze never left me. It felt as though he was drilling into my very soul with his cold, emotionless eyes. After what felt like an eternity, I finally finished my rounds in that area and made my way back to the main office space. The sense of relief was palpable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something profoundly disturbing. As the night progressed, I encountered the man several more times, always in the darkest corners of the building. Each time, he remained silent and unmoving, his presence becoming increasingly unnerving. I considered leaving and calling the authorities, but I couldn't abandon my job without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Around 4 a.m., as I tested an appliance in a remote hallway, I heard a whisper behind me. I turned to see the man, standing just inches away, his face contorted into a twisted grin. My heart pounded in my chest as he spoke, his words laced with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed, and then he lunged at me with a sudden ferocity that caught me off guard. I stumbled backward, crashing into a pile of equipment, and scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape. I sprinted through the darkened hallways, my breath ragged and my mind racing. The man pursued me, his laughter echoing in the empty corridors. Panic fueled my movements as I desperately searched for a way out. I reached the building's entrance and burst through the doors into the cool night air. Gasping for breath, I called the police, explaining the chilling encounter and the man who had pursued me. They arrived quickly and scoured the building but found no trace of the man. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he intended to do to me. All I know is that my life was forever altered by that night shift and the terror I experienced in the presence of that cruel and enigmatic stranger. My line of work was digging up streets and repairing gas pipes. It was grueling work, but it paid the bills. One chilly night, I was on the job with my crew, a group of 5 dedicated workers, all bundled up in reflective gear. The orange cones and flashing signs marked our presence on the desolate road as we dug away, the dull thud of our shovels echoing in the quiet of the night. It was around midnight when I heard the distant hum of a car engine approaching. It wasn't unusual for the occasional car to pass by, even at this hour, as some folks preferred driving at night to avoid traffic. This car, however, struck me as odd. It was an old sedan, its headlights piercing the darkness. It slowed down as it approached our work site, and I could see the silhouette of the driver behind the wheel. The car continued past us, and I thought nothing more of it until a few moments later when I heard the unmistakable sound of brakes screeching. The sedan had stopped, and its reverse lights flickered on. I exchanged puzzled glances with my crewmates as the car backed up toward us. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man inside. He looked disheveled, his face etched with deep lines of weariness. His eyes, however, were sharp and intense, locking onto me as though he could see into my very soul. It sent shivers down my spine. The man leaned out of the window, his voice low and eerie. "You're digging in the wrong place," he said, his words carrying a weight of foreboding that was impossible to ignore. Confused and more than a little unnerved, I replied, "We have the work orders and permits, sir. We're in the right spot." The man's expression darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand. You're digging in the wrong place. You need to stop." My crewmates and I exchanged alarmed glances. The situation was bizarre and unsettling. We had a job to do, and this man's cryptic warnings were causing tension to mount. But something about his demeanor made it difficult to dismiss him entirely. As if sensing our hesitation, the man's tone grew more urgent. "I've seen things, terrible things buried beneath this road. You have to stop before it's too late." I was torn between duty and the eerie feeling that this man knew something we didn't. Before I could respond, he pulled away from the window and sped off into the night, leaving us in a cloud of dust. We continued working, but the encounter had cast a shadow over the night. The man's warning lingered in our minds, and unease settled in like a thick fog. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with our task. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, we finally finished the job. But the sense of dread that had taken hold of us remained. We packed up our equipment, and I couldn't help but glance down at the freshly dug trench. What had the man meant? What had he seen? To this day, I still wonder about the chilling encounter on that desolate road, and the cryptic warning that had accompanied it. It was a night shift I would never forget, a nightmare that unfolded under the cold glow of streetlights, leaving me with a sense of unease that lingers to this very day. I used to be a lighthouse keeper on a remote island, a solitary existence that had a certain tranquility to it. My job was simple: keep the lighthouse running, ensure the light never faltered, and maintain the logs. It was a life of routine and solitude, and I had grown accustomed to it over the years. One cold, moonless night, as I sat in the lantern room, scanning the vast expanse of the dark ocean, something caught my eye. It was a faint, distant light, not the typical navigation lights of passing ships, but something much more peculiar. It was an eerie, pulsating glow, like a distant torch bobbing on the water. Curiosity piqued, I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the source of the light. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. It was a rowboat, a small wooden vessel, and inside it sat a solitary figure, rowing steadily towards the island. The glow I had seen came from a lantern affixed to the front of the boat. As the rowboat drew nearer, I could make out the silhouette of the person inside. It was a man, hunched over the oars, his movements mechanical and unceasing. There was something unsettling about the way he rowed, his actions devoid of fatigue or hesitation. I knew it was highly unusual for anyone to approach the island at this hour, especially in such a rudimentary vessel. My instincts told me to alert the authorities, but the island's communication equipment was outdated and unreliable. I was effectively on my own. The rowboat eventually reached the shore, and I watched as the man disembarked. He was tall, dressed in tattered clothing that clung to his emaciated frame. His face was obscured by the shadows of the night, making it impossible to discern his features. I couldn't understand why anyone would venture to the island in the dead of night, especially in such a strange manner. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that I would have to confront this mysterious visitor. I descended from the lighthouse and made my way down to the shore. The man stood there, unmoving, his lantern casting eerie, flickering shadows. I called out to him, asking if he needed assistance or if he was lost. He turned slowly toward me, and in the dim light, I could see his face. His eyes were hollow, devoid of emotion or recognition. It was as though he were a shell of a man, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond me. I approached cautiously, feeling a sense of foreboding wash over me. As I drew closer, I noticed something clutched in his bony hand, a weathered, old photograph. It was worn and faded, but the image was clear enough. It was a picture of me, standing beside the lighthouse. Fear gripped me, and I took a step back. How could he possibly have a photograph of me? I had never seen this man before in my life. He spoke, his voice a dry whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You were supposed to be here." I stammered, struggling to find words. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man continued to stare at the photograph, his eyes unblinking. "I was supposed to be here, but I was lost for so long." His words made no sense, and a sense of dread washed over me. I had no idea who this man was or what he was talking about. Suddenly, he looked up at me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "You were supposed to be here, but you left me behind." Before I could react, he lunged toward me, his fingers grasping for my throat. I fought back, pushing him away with all my strength, but he was relentless. It was as though he possessed an otherworldly strength. We tumbled to the ground, locked in a desperate struggle. I could feel his cold, bony fingers tightening around my throat, cutting off my air supply. Panic surged through me, and I knew I had to break free. Summoning every ounce of strength, I managed to push him off me, and I scrambled to my feet. Gasping for air, I looked down at the man, who lay motionless on the ground. He was still clutching the old photograph, his grip now slack. I wasted no time. I rushed back to the lighthouse, locked the door, and barricaded myself inside. I desperately tried to radio for help, but the ancient equipment was as uncooperative as ever. For the remainder of the night, I sat in the lantern room, my heart racing, my mind filled with questions and fear. Who was that man, and what had he meant by saying I had left him behind? As dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, I ventured back down to the shore. The rowboat was still there, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. I reported the incident to the authorities, but they could find no trace of the mysterious visitor. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread that encounter left me with. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but the memory of his cold, lifeless eyes and his cryptic words haunts me. It was a night I will never forget. I was a private investigator, and most of my work was pretty straightforward, trailing cheating spouses or digging up information on corporate rivals. But one case I took on one rainy night was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. I had been hired to keep an eye on a wealthy businessman suspected of embezzlement. He lived in a sprawling mansion nestled deep within an exclusive gated community, and my job was to watch his every move from a nondescript van parked nearby. The rain fell relentlessly, making my surveillance all the more miserable. Hours passed, and the businessman showed no sign of wrongdoing. I grew restless and considered calling it a night when something caught my eye. A shadowy figure had emerged from the woods, clad in a dark hooded cloak. They moved stealthily, almost ghost-like, making their way toward the mansion. Intrigued, I focused my camera on this mysterious visitor. They approached the mansion's back entrance, which was concealed from the view of any passerby. With the rain pouring down, I couldn't get a clear shot of their face, but I knew this was my chance to uncover something significant. As the cloaked figure reached the entrance, I saw them produce a set of lock-picking tools and deftly work on the door. My heart raced. Was this a burglary? A sinister plot against the businessman? I had to find out. Carefully, I exited my van and moved closer, my camera trained on the intruder. My footsteps were muffled by the rain-soaked ground, but my nerves were on edge. I knew I was crossing a line, but my curiosity got the better of me. Just as the cloaked figure seemed to gain entry to the mansion, I heard a sudden rustling in the bushes behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, and shone my flashlight into the darkness. My hand trembled as I scanned the area, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I returned my attention to the mansion, only to find that the cloaked figure had disappeared inside. Panic surged through me. Should I call the police? What if this was a trap? I knew I had to finish what I'd started. Slowly, I approached the mansion and cautiously entered through the same entrance the intruder had used. The mansion was dark, and the air inside felt heavy with anticipation. I moved silently through the dimly lit hallways, my heart racing with every step. I finally reached a grand study, where I could hear hushed voices. Peering through a cracked door, I saw the cloaked figure engaged in conversation with the businessman. They were arguing, their voices rising with tension. My camera captured every moment, and I realized that this was a pivotal moment in my investigation. But just as I was about to make my escape to safety, a creaking floorboard betrayed my presence. The businessman turned and saw me. Fear and anger flashed in his eyes, and before I could react, he shouted for his security team. I bolted, running through the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, the businessman's shouts echoing behind me. As I reached the back entrance, I heard footsteps closing in. Panic coursed through me, and I fumbled for my car keys. Just as I reached my van, I glanced back to see the businessman's security team closing in on me. I slammed the van's door shut and peeled out of the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. I had uncovered something big, but I had also become the hunted. I never did get a chance to review the photographs I had taken that night. My priority was to get away safely, and I never returned to that mansion or took on another case like it. The memory of that chilling encounter still haunts me, a reminder of the thin line between being a private investigator and becoming part of the case itself. A few years back, I used to be a long-haul trucker, crisscrossing the country's highways during the graveyard shift. Nights on the road were eerie, especially when you're all alone, and your only company is the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of asphalt under your headlights. But nothing could have prepared me for the chilling encounter I had one fateful night. It was a particularly dark and stormy night, the kind where rain seemed to fall in torrents, making visibility nearly impossible. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and the sound of thunder echoed in the distance. I had a strict schedule to keep, and I wasn't about to let a storm slow me down. As I cruised down a desolate stretch of highway, I noticed a faint silhouette up ahead. It was a hitchhiker, standing alone in the pouring rain with a thumb extended. Now, I'd heard all the warnings about picking up strangers on the road, but something about this person tugged at me. I decided to pull over, the splash of the puddles beneath my tires marking my approach. The hitchhiker was a young woman, soaked to the bone, with matted hair clinging to her face. She had a haunted look in her eyes, one that spoke of desperation and fear. I rolled down the window and asked if she needed a ride. Her voice was soft and tremulous as she accepted. She climbed into the cab, and I offered her a towel to dry off. She introduced herself as Sarah, and the story she told was nothing short of terrifying. Sarah explained that her car had broken down miles back, leaving her stranded in the storm. She'd been walking for hours, drenched and scared, with no other choice but to hitchhike. She didn't have a cell phone to call for help, and she looked like someone who had been through hell. As we continued down the highway, Sarah grew more talkative, and her story took a darker turn. She mentioned a man, a sinister figure who had been following her for miles, lurking in the shadows of the woods that bordered the road. She described him as a tall, imposing presence, and fear crept into her voice as she spoke. I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror, scanning the darkness for any signs of this mysterious pursuer. I saw nothing, but the feeling of unease settled in my gut. Sarah's story became increasingly erratic, her words disjointed and filled with paranoia. She claimed the man had threatened her, promised to find her no matter where she went. She begged me to keep driving, to get as far away from him as possible. The rain pounded on the roof of the truck, drowning out all other sounds. I was torn between believing Sarah's disturbing tale and thinking she might be suffering from delusions brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the chilling sensation that we were being watched. As we approached a deserted stretch of road, Sarah suddenly let out a piercing scream. My heart raced as I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. I turned to see her pointing at something outside the window, her eyes wide with terror. In the dim glow of the headlights, I saw him, the tall, menacing figure, standing in the middle of the road. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadows. The sight of him sent a shiver down my spine. Without a second thought, I slammed the truck into reverse and sped away from the looming figure. The hitchhiker's pleas for me to go faster filled the cab, but I was already pushing the old rig to its limits. As we left that nightmarish encounter behind, Sarah's fear began to subside, replaced by gratitude. She thanked me profusely for coming to her rescue, and I assured her that she was safe now. Hours later, we reached a small town, and I dropped her off at a motel, promising to cover her room for the night. She insisted that she'd be okay and needed no more than shelter from the storm. I never learned the full truth about Sarah's ordeal that night, and we parted ways without exchanging contact information. But the memory of that chilling encounter still lingers with me. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't picked her up or if I had encountered that sinister figure in the darkness. Working as a night sewer inspector in the heart of the city was never glamorous. My job involved crawling through tight, dimly lit underground tunnels, navigating a labyrinth of pipes and filth. It was a lonely and eerie existence, made even more unsettling by the strange encounter I had one night. It was past midnight when I descended into the depths of the city's sewer system. The flickering fluorescent lights provided little comfort as I trudged through the muck and waste. The air was thick with the pungent stench of sewage, and every sound seemed to echo endlessly through the tunnels. As I made my way deeper into the maze of pipes, I began to hear something unusual, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was out of place in the otherwise desolate sewer, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I followed the noise, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and soon I discovered its source. There, in a narrow alcove, I found a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard boxes and discarded debris. And inside this grim shelter was a person, huddled in the dim light. I couldn't make out much about them at first, just the silhouette of a human figure. "Hey, what are you doing down here?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, and my unease grew. I cautiously approached, revealing the face of a middle-aged man with wild, unkempt hair and a long, ragged beard. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to reflect the dim light like a trapped animal. I live here," he mumbled, his voice quivering. My heart pounded in my chest. People didn't live in the sewers. The man's appearance was hauntingly tragic, his clothes tattered and filthy, his skin covered in sores and grime. I asked him how he had ended up here, and he began to ramble incoherently. He mentioned losing his job, his home, and his family. He spoke of a downward spiral that had led him to this wretched existence beneath the city. I felt a mixture of pity and fear as I listened to his disjointed tale. I couldn't leave him down here, but I couldn't bring him with me either. My job was to inspect, not to play social worker. With a heavy heart, I left him a bottle of water and some protein bars, promising to notify the authorities and get him help. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly sharp and intense. "You can't tell anyone about me," he hissed, his grip tightening. "I won't go back." I tried to pull away, but his grip was relentless. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. The man was unhinged, desperate, and capable of anything. In that dim, underground chamber, I had a chilling encounter that left me shaking to my core. I managed to break free from his grasp, leaving him behind in the foul depths of the sewer. I fled the tunnels, my heart pounding, vowing never to return. I did report the encounter to the authorities, but I never learned what became of the man. It haunted my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left him to suffer in the darkness. The city's underbelly held secrets and horrors I couldn't fathom, and that night, I had stumbled upon one of its most disturbing mysteries.